Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who is dissatisfied with the two-party system, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who wants more and better choices on the ballot, welcome home. I'm going to start off this episode with a question. Are you casting a ballot in the upcoming election for someone or against them? If you said against, you are among a growing number of Americans. We're going to dive into the data and what that means for this country. But first, I know we talked about this last episode. Have you been paying attention to the polls at all this week?
Honestly, I would be 100% honest. Every time I see a report about a new poll, I kind of flip away at this point.
I think the best thing that is going to come out of this election is the death of polling. Like,
Maybe.
how many times can a professional, someone trained in data analysis, come to the table, right? Get behind a microphone, get in front of a camera, and be like, I don't know. They should literally just release a press release with a big shrug emoji on it for everything I've seen.
Well, yeah, this election's tight for months now. We don't need the same pollster coming out every single day to talk about how tight a race is. That's been tight.
No. You've got 538. And you've got Nate Silver. Now it has his own newsletter. Yeah. It's basically saying the same thing. Like, we don't know. We don't know. Pennsylvania, I don't know. And now they've got... So NBC News is now releasing early voting data, which is like criminal, first off. But they're releasing which parties have requested the most ballots, which parties have returned the most ballots. And my understanding is this is all data modeling. So these aren't even real numbers, right? Like, just stop it, please.
All it does is serve to make people more anxious. And that's the reason why I don't look at polling numbers anymore. Because one, they release, again, every single day. They're releasing these numbers. And
yes,
a lot of these polling agencies, they've existed for a long time. This is nothing new that you would have a bunch of groups come out with polls. However, the media wasn't always so fixated on every single poll that came out. Yeah. That is something that's changed over the election cycles, where now, to speak to what we talked about in the last episode, is all the media wants to do is focus on the polls right now. And so they'll pick even the ones that are not seen as credible or as credible as some other polls by groups like 538. That doesn't really matter anymore. It doesn't matter. The strength of the poll doesn't really matter anymore. It's just, can we create new graphs? Can we put new pie charts out there for people to see?
Yeah. I am clicking refresh. I'm going to tell you, they've got me hooked. My Twitter feed, it is polls. It is global warming. We're all going to die. And somehow I have gotten into this like subtle white supremacist world where everyone's talking about how things were better when Europeans ran things. And that's my Twitter feed.
Well, I mean,
I don't know.
That just sounds like what Twitter is becoming, though. And one of the reasons why is because there are people, including myself, who are leaving Twitter now. We see what it's become under Elon Musk, who initially said he wanted to take it over because of the perceived political bias of the network. And now he very outspoken Trump supporter who is being very vocal about his own political biases on this app. It's a mark of hypocrisy, but also just a very damning indictment of what the platform has become.
Yeah, so you left me with all the crazies. All right, fair enough. So let's move on to the story of the day. Sean, my social media feed has been abuzz with rumors of a story that could potentially derail Trump's campaign. I don't know if you've heard this or not.
Now, are these stories on top of some of the other stuff that we got this week, like what Trump had said about a Latina service member, and then also John Kelly coming out and saying, at one point he praised Hitler and said he did some great things. Is it on top of all those things?
You're kind of making my point for me here. You're kind of making my point for me because I was like,
right.
what could it possibly be?
Mm-hmm.
The no. First off, I'll start off with what sparked this rumor. So, journalist Mark Halperin, who was one of the first folks to report that Biden would exit the race earlier this year, said on his YouTube channel, and I'll give you a quote. I know of one story. I don't believe it is true, but if it is true, it would end Donald Trump's campaign, which first off is outrageously vague. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe Santa is real, but if he is, boy, am I in for one hell of a Christmas, Shawn. But yeah, I heard it, and first off, it's like, what possibly could it be? Like, the only thing I could think of is maybe Trump is actually Obama in a Trump suit, and I don't even know if that would do it, but like, he's trying to Scooby-Doo the campaign.
Well, and then when I look at this, there's that old thing that Trump said where he could shoot someone and not lose any votes, right? And
Mm-hmm.
people have talked about that. I recently saw an op-ed piece that focused on that and said, we're getting to a point where, yes, there is some we don't know, like if he shot someone, would he lose any votes? And at this point, he may not.
No, he will not. He will not. And I don't know what frustrates me more, the fact that he won't, or the fact that there are throngs of people who buy into it every single
Mm-hmm.
time. It is like Wile E. Coyote thinking he's going to finally catch the Roadrunner. So, in my frustration, I did a little searching and I came across some research done by Pew on political polarization in general. And one of the interesting things that I saw was that negative voting, so that is voting against a candidate rather than for one, has more than doubled since 2000. So, was about 30% in 2000, was a little under 60% in 2020. So, I'm going to ask you, Shawn, who do you think was worse? Democrats, Republicans, or independents?
For negative voting,
For negative voting. Who was voting against more than they were voting for?
my instinct would be to say Republicans, but
Yeah, it's a trick question because I asked you, right?
right.
So, interestingly enough, I went into this thinking it was going to be independents for sure. I thought for sure it was going to be independents. Turns out the amount of negative voting by political independents is actually lower than partisans. So it's either typically, like historically, it's either been on par with partisans or just a little lower. So to put some numbers behind that, in 2020, instances of negative voting amongst independents was about 10% lower than partisans. So they were at 50%. Democrats and Republicans were roughly at about 60%. And Democrats and Republicans, there's really not a noticeable difference. They actually move in lockstep with each other. I found this interesting because what it tells us is that partisans are more bought into the idea that the other party is a threat than they are into their own vision of what they'll do once they're in office.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And you can look at just how the parties have entrenched themselves. A lot of that, as we've spoken about on this podcast, has to do with the way that the system is developed to ensure that the parties just further and further entrench themselves behind their side. And then you get into this situation where you already have your diehard members who are going to support your policies no matter what they are. You don't have to sell them on your policies, but you can sell them and get them rallied up in each election by talking about how evil the other side is,
Mm-hmm.
how bad they are, what the damage they're going to do to this country. Because we heard, I mean, we hear it in this election cycle. One side is a danger to democracy. The other side says that their opponents are going to destroy the country as we know it. We hear that in this election cycle, but it's not new to this election cycle. It's just that the rhetoric is getting more intense, and so much so that even the political pundits on talk shows, who for the most part can remain civil with each other, even when they're discussing policy difference, even those conversations are getting more heated. You've noticed this if you watch MSNBC or Fox News or CNN,
Mm-hmm.
when they have roundtable discussions, it's even more heated now than it used to be between these professional pundits, just because of the emotion that's being put into negative campaigning by the parties, just to get their other side to not only hate the opposing party, but to bolster their desire to vote against that party.
There's something you said in there that I want to hone in on, which is that the parties are more focused on the threat posed by the other party than they are what they're going to give voters
Mm-hmm.
effectively. And I think it raises the question for me, like, what are voters going to get out of this? And I'll pick on the Democrats for a bit because they're more pro government expansion, more pro government intervention. But the Democrats will talk about, like, the CHIPS Act, for example. Like, look, we
Right.
got the CHIPS Act, and it's like, that's great, but if I'm somebody in Maryland who was, barely making ends meet, and now my grocery bill is 20% higher and my rent's higher and I can't afford a house. I mean, the CHIPS Act isn't coming to my state. So I think they cite these programs as if they make this huge overarching difference.
Right.
And then when they don't cite programs, they're citing how the Republicans stand in the way of their programs,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's like, either way, what you're telling us is that what you're doing when you're in office is not necessarily getting the job done, right? And so I have this big question, and I'm not somebody who feels that government doesn't do anything, and I'm not somebody who feels that it's not valuable. But on the same token, I do have to wonder, for those folks who haven't made up their mind about who they're going to vote for, which is bizarre to me,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have an opinion on Donald Trump yet. You don't know whether you're going to vote for Trump or not, right? But
Right.
it tells me that to those people don't see what's in it for them.
I think when you look at what pollsters, for instance, I covered a conversation between Frank Luntz and Andrew Yang this
Mm-hmm.
past week. And he talked about how when you look at undecided voters, they don't like how mean and nasty Trump is. But they also don't object to his policies, or at least what his message is focused on, things like the economy and immigration, right? They're concerned about inflation. They're concerned about this notion of a not secured enough border, that people are just flooding into the country. These are things that many undecided voters are concerned about, but they won't vote for him, or at least they won't make a decision on him, because they just don't like him. And on the other side of that, they look at Kamala Harris and they see somebody who may not be speaking to all the issues they want her to be speaking to. And they want to hear more than just, my values haven't changed. So I think there are still a very small percentage of voters out there who this is weighing on them. But as someone who has made up his mind about who he's voting for, I agree with you. I don't see how at this point, if you object to Trump that much, how you haven't really made up your mind on this election.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Exactly. I've got a theory, and I'm going to take us a little out on a limb. But my theory is that Americans on the whole have a higher baseline level of fear and stress than they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's not hard to get stressed and scared people attached to the idea that something bad is going to happen,
Right.
right? So a couple years ago, I interviewed a guy named Andrei Sherbak. He's a professor of political science at HSC St. Petersburg. That's the Russian St. Petersburg, not the Florida one, in case you're wondering. And he did a study on the link between diet and democracy. And what he found is that an increase in the consumption of animal protein was predictive of democratic reforms, right?
Mm.
So if people were eating more meat, eggs, drinking more milk, that was a predictor of democratic reforms. And his findings aren't that, like, if you eat more steak, the country's going to be more free, as much as many of us think that, but rather that the consumption of high quality animal protein says that there's growing wealth, that there's a growing middle class,
right,
and that the middle class generally demands more from their government, demands a more responsive government. Now, the interesting thing here is that the reverse is true. So a decrease in the consumption of animal proteins in a population's diet is indicative of democratic backsliding. So again, I'm not making the claim that it's our diet that's causing polarization,
right,
even though the American diet could use a lot of work. But what I do think is you have this degradation of the middle class. You have
right.
this increase in income inequality. And that puts a lot of stress on your average American.
Mm-hmm.
And as they are more stressed, as they are more scared, right, they're more likely to be skeptical of the power of government or suspicious of government. And they're also more likely to ascribe to fear-based messaging.
Right. But I also think the more that voters hear fear-based messaging, the more they look inward and they look at just how the system is failing them personally. Getting back to what you said about, our voters just looking at this from a very self-centered point of view. And I think there are a lot of voters. I think
Yeah.
you are seeing that a lot with Trump supporters, but also even for these undecided voters who, even if they don't like Trump, they look at the current state of things and they look at their grocery bills, they look at their gas prices, and they say, well, things just weren't as good as they were 4 years ago. Well, in terms of prices, even though 4 years ago, middle of pandemic, right?
Yes.
But they look at that, they look at their own circumstance, and this to me may be driving the why you still see 2-3% of voters who are undecided is because of this idea of if they can't afford or they feel like they can't afford meats and milk and the very base products that you would buy for groceries, right, which can speak to this kind of study, then they're always going to be looking for a candidate that's going to be the change candidate. They're always, so even if they don't like Donald Trump, they look at the current administration that hasn't really, to at least in their mind, done enough for them, right? For them
Yeah.
personally. And so that leaves them into this, well, I don't know which way I'm going to vote. Even even when you only have one serious candidate running.
Yes. Yes. And I'll tell you first off, yes, there was a pandemic, but let's also remember like half of America was getting paid to sit around in their pajamas.
Yeah.
It was like a national slumber party. So yeah, I mean, it was, in some respects, it's really easy to look back on that era and say, hey, that was pretty nice. But I think this is why the push by Kamala Harris and her surrogates and anti-Trump Republicans to label Trump as a fascist
Mm-hmm.
isn't landing.
Right.
Because I honestly don't think Americans care about their rights. I don't think anybody cares about their rights. I really don't. And if you go back in history to any national crisis, Americans were more than willing to throw their rights out the window. I mean, you only have to go back to 9/11 when we expanded presidential war powers. We expanded surveillance powers. You go back to the Red Scare. You go back to World War II when they locked up not Japanese people, but Americans of Japanese descent whose families had been there for years and didn't even speak Japanese.
Right.
Right? So Americans are more than willing to throw out the Constitution if the situation gets dire. And I think this is just maybe one of those cases. Maybe people are more concerned about, gas prices than they are whether they'll be able to vote next year.
It's a mind-boggling thing for sure to think about. Just the fact that so many Americans are willing to focus more on, the price of groceries, which, by the way, go up every year. Groceries are more expensive now than they were under Trump. Groceries were more expensive under Trump than they were under Obama, right? Every few years, you're just going to naturally see this increase. It gets to basic economic principles of things like supply and demand. But I also wonder, and I'm a little bit concerned when I see the state of our current elections and how voters are responding to it, particularly the fact that they're still undecided voters, how cynicism and negative campaigning and negative coverage, things we've talked about on this podcast, have possibly resulted in voters just not taking politics in this country seriously anymore. And it's concerning to think about, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but there's so many variables that go into this, including what we talked about in the last episode about all these retiring members of Congress who recognize that the system is broken, that they can't get anything done in Washington, anything meaningful, any lasting change can't happen right now because of the partisan divide. So when you look at voters who are always looking for that change candidate, who never see that actual change candidate emerge that they're looking for, how do they send a message? How do they effectively send a message to Washington about what they're looking for? And if they feel hopeless that that's even possible, maybe we're at a point where a lot of voters just don't take voting seriously anymore.
Yeah. And I don't think I don't think voters are wrong for thinking their vote doesn't matter. You know, I don't think voters are wrong for thinking that government isn't responsive, because it is not. It is not. So if you go back to 1997, right, there were 164 swing seats in the House of Representatives. That means 164 members of Congress, roughly about 40% of the body, had to worry about losing their job if they didn't deliver, right? Okay. You fast forward to 2024, there are, at this point in time, 25 competitive House races. 25. Right? That's like 5% of Congress has to worry about their political future if Congress doesn't produce.
Right.
And so, and again, I think we've talked about this before. Congressional productivity is at an all-time low. The number of bills getting passed are at an all-time low, but not just the number of bills, because the number of bills being passed could be read as maybe the government shouldn't be passing any bills. And that'd be a good thing. But the percentage of bills that make it into law has decreased as well. That means when people in Congress actually want to get laws passed, it doesn't happen. So you have these people who are effectively entrenched in their seats. They're not accountable to the majority of voters. They're not accountable to produce. The rise in negative partisanship means the only thing that their voters want them to do is to stop the other side from getting their agenda passed.
Right.
And so it's no wonder you have a group of people who are questioning, like, why bother?
Yeah. And you know what? About a decade ago, there was a Princeton study that found that no matter what public interest was in a bill or what public opinion polls said the public viewed on the subject of a bill, every bill that was introduced had the same low percentage of passing. It didn't matter what the subject matter was, the same flat, low percentage of passing, which meant, and this was the conclusion of Princeton, that Americans have a net zero impact on whether or not bills are passed or blocked in the legislature. And this was a decade ago, and things have only gotten worse. And voters sense that, voters see that. And so, yeah, I don't blame voters for feeling a bit cynical right now. But I also understand why there's a growing number of activists and voters and groups who are looking at the current system and saying something needs to change. Because under the current process, things are only getting worse. We're only locked in this never-ending cycle of even just basic issues that the government should be able to find some common ground on, just being kicked further down the road a little bit. And nothing's going to get done until we actually fix how our elected officials are elected in the first place.
Yes. Thank you for taking us back to positive take action land, because I tend to get mired down.
Well, it's so easy in this environment to go directly to the negative of it.
Of course it is.
It is,
it's what we've been talking about.
It's what we've been talking about. Exactly. Yeah. And it doesn't really surprise me that independent voters do not participate in negative voting as much as partisans, because you also see other surveys, other public opinion polls that show that more than anything, what independent minded voters want right now is a candidate who will work to solve problems, who is willing to work with the other side, who stands on a policy position, but is also willing to amend that position when necessary, when they're presented with facts. And if it means coming to the table and finding lasting solutions with people who are on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And I think if I'm to play future historian, right, and I'm analyzing the post-World War II era of American history, I think we went from real democracy, where government was responsive to the voters, government was providing for the voters. Then we went to fake democracy, where different interests had entrenched themselves in government and were really unaccountable, but kept saying, hey, it's important to vote, it's important to vote, it's important to vote. Mm-hmm. And now we're at this kind of like turning point where we can either say, okay, well, let's just call it what it is and go straight to oligarchy or autocracy or whatever you want, or let's do something to change it. And I think to your point, there are things ordinary people like you listening to this right now can do to better the situation. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the state by state movements to make folks in government more accountable via ranked choice voting, via open primaries, via top four, that's the ticket. That's how we do it. The reason that especially House members don't have to be responsive to you is because they don't have to worry about losing their jobs. Mm-hmm. And if you eliminate the stranglehold that these parties have on specific districts, which you can do with reforms, especially top four voting, I think is my favorite for this. Mm-hmm. You can start to make it so these people really have to know where the consensus opinion in their districts lie. And that's the ticket. It is not electing Kamala. It is not electing Trump. They're, at best, they're going to write a bunch of executive orders you like that are going to be reversed the next time the White House changes parties.
I think voters, they want to be able to vote for a change candidate, but that's impossible in the current cycle. And the process has gotten worse. We've seen more gridlock. We've seen more inaction on some of the biggest issues, no matter who's in charge. Mm-hmm. And again, to speak to your point, I think more voters are becoming aware of this. It's fueling cynicism, but It's also because voters want to latch on to something they can hope for. We've had this system for decades now, where the two major parties in control have been able to write the rules to their own benefit. And so they don't have to worry about re-election unless they piss off their party in some way. And then they have to worry about being primaried. So by changing the system, you are opening a process not only to all voters, but you are ending the partisan weaponization of elections, mm-hmm. which can benefit the major parties in a way, but also keep us locked where we are today.
Amen. Amen. And I think we are going to leave it there. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics. If you liked what you heard today, please rate this. Please leave it a review. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. And as always, if you didn't like what you heard today, just keep it between us. That would be wonderful. Thank you again for listening, and stay purple.